I'm Howard Husick, Vice President for Policy and Research at the Manhattan Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion of one of the most important issues of our moment, what's happened to the university. The Institute is very proud to be co-sponsoring this with the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, an organization for which we have the greatest respect and admiration. And now to introduce our program, the President and CEO of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, Greg Lukianoff.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to the Manhattan Institute for co-sponsoring this event. I want to cover a fair amount of ground, pretty much all of FIRE history, so I'm going to talk fairly quickly. It's my natural speed anyway. FIRE was founded in 1999 by Alan Charles Kors, a professor of the Enlightenment at the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvey Silverglate, a civil liberties lawyer from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've been at FIRE since 2001, and even though the issue of freedom of speech on campus didn't always garner so much media attention, it has been shockingly easy to get in trouble for what you say on a college campus since my very first day at FIRE. In my 2012 book, Unlearning Liberty, I tried to pin down what factors made campuses so hostile to freedom of speech. The first was, of course, ideology and groupthink, made possible by institutions that lead overwhelmingly to the left. The most recent survey placed the average number of registered Democrats versus Republicans in most departments at 10 to 1, with history departments showing a tilt of 34 to 1. And that's the latest data we have on that. But other lesser-known factors, including the massive expansion of campus bureaucracy, as well as the fear of litigation and the Department of Education, have played a role. Mostly the fear of litigation was exaggerated, but universities did have more to fear from even frivolous anti-discrimination lawsuits than they had from First Amendment lawsuits, which before we started doing them were a lot less common. Meanwhile, the fear of the Department of Education was highly exaggerated for most of my career. For example, in 2003, the Department of Education said that the college's duty to stop sexual harassment could not be used as an excuse to permit unconstitutional speech codes. Unfortunately, that changed between 2011 and 2013 when the newly activist Department of Education proposed a new definition of new unconstitutional requirements on universities, requirements that actually encouraged overreaction. You may be surprised to hear that for most of my career, campus administrators, not students, were the most eager censors. Indeed, students were the most pro-free speech constituency on campus, far better than administrators, that's for sure, and even professors. That changed during 2013-2014. The first event that really signaled this to us was Ray Kelly being shut down at Brown. It was almost like this happened overnight, seemingly overnight. Student activists became the proponents of new speech codes, microaggression policies, trigger warnings, and disinvitation attempts. What was also fairly novel was that administrators were increasingly trying to justify these paternalistic policies by using pseudoscientific medical terminology to rationalize their censorship. That's why my friend, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and I wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2015 called The Coddling of the American Mind. We wanted to know what the supposedly scientific basis for censorship, we wanted people to know that the supposedly scientific basis for censorship was worse than nonsense. We evaluated what students were taught through the lens of cognitive behavioral therapy and concluded that administrators were essentially telling students the following: you are extremely fragile. If you hear things that bother you, you might never recover. And overgeneralizing, labeling, catastrophizing are all good mental habits. These are terrible habits of mind and are known in the therapy realm as cognitive distortions. And any psychologist who tries to actually encourage them should be fired. Not coincidentally, finding and identifying wild mental exaggerations, a core component of CBT, relates to the very skill that universities are supposed to be all about, critical thinking. So we saw the impressive success of CBT in dealing with anxiety and depression as a potential way to construct a new and additional argument for critical thinking on campus. I know, a radical idea, teaching rationality at college. Unfortunately, within weeks of the publication of the article, John and I saw two new trends. First was a reemergence of a particularly nasty form of identity politics. While I have heard that this was similar to what happened in the late 80s and early 90s, generally minority students were not the ones making demands for new speech codes. It was mostly, as I said, administrators. And the second phase of this began only in the first few months, in the last few months, when progressive censors merged with identity groups have begun responding to conservative and libertarian speakers with actual physical violence. This is most notable at the February 1st riots in Berkeley, California, where if you watch the videotapes, which I've spent a lot of time watching these, you will be amazed that no one was actually killed. It's much worse than it was reported. It can be seen at Middlebury, where a professor was sent to the hospital by student protesters for attending Charles Murray's, for defending Charles Murray's right to speak, despite the fact she disagreed with them on many things. It can be seen in the situation going on now at Evergreen State University. If you don't know about that, it's horrifying. Where students are roaming the campus with baseball bats after a liberal professor objected to a day of racial segregation, which was supposed to somehow demonstrate progressive values. And of course, there's Heather McDonald's terrible treatment at Claremont McKenna College, where students forcibly prevented their classmates from even entering the building when she was speaking. Nevertheless, during this time, FIRE has actually been winning and gaining ground on the old fights. Federal regulation that has dogged us for years appears likely to be at least somewhat reined in, hopefully entirely, and speech codes are on the decline thanks to over 60 speech codes lawsuits that have made First Amendment cases more frequent and more expensive for schools. Nevertheless, this new, nastier culture war has a powerful and negative implications that go far beyond campus, a topic that John Haidt and I are exploring in our forthcoming book. Before turning over the panel, I would just like to say to everyone in the room that universities are not lost causes, and they do respond to the will of alumni and donors. No university deserves your generosity if they foster such anti-intellectual practices and habits. You have power to fight back, and I hope you'll join us in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight from the University of Kent in the UK, where he's the Emeritus Professor of Sociology, Professor Frank Furedi. He's the author of the book, which is featured at the booksellers table in the back, What's Happened to the University, a sociological exploration of its infantilization. It's the latest of about a dozen books that he's published, an impressive list since 2001, including one, Furedi, a sociological history, particularly intriguing. Heather McDonald, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor to City Journal, and the author of The War on Cops, the most timely book which has really galvanized discussion around the nation. And I'd like to try to set the scene for this discussion about academic freedom and the upheavals that we've been seeing around the country by asking Heather to set the scene for us by actually recounting in a compressed fashion the incident to which Greg referred. What actually happened when you were at Claremont McKenna, and as Bob Dylan once asked, how did it feel?
Oh, as one who does not believe in discussions of feelings, I'm a little reluctant to get into that, but I guess if forced, I'll share a few with you. I was told the day before I was supposed to speak at Claremont McKenna, I got an urgent, one of those, red flagged emails from one of the administrators that they'd gotten wind of a brewing protest and were thinking of moving the event to a building with fewer plate glass windows and better means of egress. This was not exactly reassuring. The Facebook protest had said, we refuse to give fascism a platform. We refuse to have Heather McDonald speak. Recall, these are the people that purport to be against unbridled exercises of power. When I got to campus, they'd decided to keep it in the original venue known as the Athenaeum on Claremont McKenna College because they hadn't heard any further agitation going on. But I was put in what was essentially a safe house with the blinds drawn, from which I couldn't see the event venue, but I could hear what was happening, which was increased chanting, increased drumming. I saw a girl walk by with her face covered, this was a petite blonde, with her face all covered with a Palestinian headscarf, with a bullhorn amplifier on her back. Underneath my safe house on the stairs were students sort of guarding me, and I did not have the courage to wave to them, I'm afraid. And I will admit, without wanting to adopt the same sort of maudlin rhetoric of the victimologist, that it did cross my mind to imagine what it felt like in the French Revolution, as you hear the mob growing ever more hysterical. So I was brought into the Athenaeum via a secret passageway with police escort to a huge empty room. And what had gone on, which again was outside of my vision, was that students, 300 of them, had blockaded the building, completely making mincemeat of the little police barricades that were erected to try and keep the entrances open. And the police, as is typical in our Black Lives Matter era now, stood down. They didn't want to offend the student darlings, and they certainly didn't want to be caught on video using force. So the students took over. The protocol was that the white students were supposed to stand between the police and the students of color, because of course the campus police at Claremont would have been so brutal to the students of color. Chants were things like, hey, hey, ho, ho, Heather Mack has got to go, from Portland to Greece, F the police, shut down the effing fascist. So I was in the room. Nobody else was, except for a contingent of police officers. I gave my speech to an empty room. The buffet that had been planned, I was supposed to have met with students beforehand and talked with them about my book. And by the way, what I was going to say that was so violently unacceptable to these students was that there is, in fact, no police agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter, and that there is enormous unreported support for the police and minority communities. I also had outside, there were counter-protesters. One guy brought a sound system to try and play Stars and Stripes Forever. The audio cable was promptly stolen. A student from the campus alternative newspaper that was trying to live stream found himself attacked. A faculty who tried to get in was basically beaten up. So I gave my speech to an empty room. It was live streamed. The university is very proud of itself that it allowed me to live stream my talk. What was most disconcerting was the few people that were in the room were not paying attention to me. They were riveted by what was happening outside. Students were pounding on the plate glass windows and shouting. The lectern had been moved before the speech from away from the windows so that when the lights went on inside, I would not be visible. So I was put basically behind an actual transparent, opaque wall. I took 2 questions via live streaming, and at that point, the police decided they could no longer protect my safety. An escape plan was quickly devised, and I was hustled through the kitchen and into a waiting police van and sped away to the Claremont Police Department. So it was not the high point of open-mindedness in academic history, that's for sure.
Well, I know our hats are off to you for going through that.
Thank you.
And so I'm going to turn, I think what we're going to try to do in this panel discussion is to figure out how did we come to this? And I want to start with Frank and ask him for his view as encapsulated in this book. How did we get to this point?
Well, I think you have to remember that the horrible experience that Heather had is really just the tip of the iceberg, because fortunately they're still fairly rare. But for every terrible mob scene that Heather described, there are large numbers of banal, everyday incidents that are going on within classrooms, within seminars, and in cafeterias, all over in all the universities. And to me, that's far more of a problem, that when you walk around and talk to people, you have to deal with the fact that a lot of students, for example, are self-censoring themselves. So, for example, there would have been a lot of students on that campus who were horrified by what happened. But at the moment, they haven't got the moral and the intellectual resources to do very much about it. So instead of reacting and instead of supporting you, what they do is they censor themselves, or alternatively, they acquiesce or pretend it's not happening. They kind of conform to the prevailing climate. And the main challenge that we all face is that at the moment, the current zeitgeist works in such a way that they're the ones that dominate campus culture, campus life, and everybody else just either reacts to it defensively or alternatively goes along with it. So the question becomes how we deal and how we manage these things.
Well, I think the conventional wisdom is this is put in political terms. There's a PC enforcement mobs of some kind, that Heather's views are what are being objected to. And in your book, you have a slightly more nuanced take.
Well, I think what's really important to realize, because you're all American, is that it actually has got very little to do with any of the American institutions or the American laws or anything specifically American. Because pretty much the same kind of atmosphere, the same kind of cultural processes are at work in Canada. It's a very different political system than the American one. If you look at Australia, you go on an Australian campus, very similar attitudes have crystallized and work in the same way, and also in England. Again, a very different political system, and yet, miraculously, in all of these different places with very different political traditions and institutions, there's the same cultural zeitgeist on campuses. So why is that? And what I argue in my book is that actually it's got nothing to do with 1960s radicalism, or very little. There's no real continuity. I mean, I've been in universities. I'm probably the oldest person in this room. I've been in campuses since 1965 as a student, so I've seen it all. There's very little in common with 1960s radicalism. And also, the main impulse behind it does not begin in university. If you go and talk to children when they're 5, 6, 7, and 8, 9, or 10, they've already been through a process of acculturation where they come home from school with smiley faces. You know, if you see I still remember my son the first time he came home, age 9, with 20 smiley faces. You know, little Einstein. You know, and I said, well, how come you got so many smiley faces? He says, we all did. Everybody in the classroom got smiley faces. So you have this situation where within schools, instead of socializing young people into proper values, teaching them character, teaching them resilience, what we do is we validate them. I mean, that's the basic approach. We validate them, we affirm them, we raise their self-esteem, and we teach them that they're actually relatively powerless, weak individuals who need continuous therapeutic support of some form or another. And if you go through the whole school system, for example, in my country, in England, it got to the stage where safe space pedagogy was introduced in schools a long time before students began to demand safe spaces at universities. We had a situation in England where, for example, trigger warnings, you all know what trigger warnings are and the demand for trigger warnings. Well, we had a situation where high school students were told that you don't have to listen to lectures about suicide or lectures about difficult subjects because we know you're going to be traumatized by this. So already, you know, by the time they come to university, they basically been validated to the point at which they feel that they are entitled to validation. They actually feel that they're entitled to be told, you know, that they are kind of nice people. And if you don't validate them, then that's a cultural crime.
And so for you, the discussion of safe spaces and trigger warnings, these are not rationalizations. These are real feelings that have been inculcated. So it's a kind of an extra political analysis, if you will, offer. Does that sound right to you, Heather?
Well, I recommend Professor Furedi's book to everybody. It's an astounding compendium of a cultural shift with examples that are mind-boggling. And one of the great discoveries of it is how the whole Anglo world has been taken over by this. So it's a must-read. I, however, disagree to a certain extent with both Fires, Jonathan Haidt's, and Professor Furedi's diagnosis, because I think a psychological explanation is not right. I think this is an ideological issue. Note that white male students on campus, heterosexual white male students, are perhaps the most stigmatized, the most vilified group on campus, and they are not demanding safe spaces. I see this as we have reached, Greg rightly says, well, what happened in 2013? Arguably, at that point, we reached the critical mass of the dominant ideology in the universities for the last 20 years, excuse me, at least, which is victimology, and particularly racial victimology. Universities today are dedicated to the proposition that the US or Canada or Australia or Britain represents a literally threatening environment of bigotry and oppression to people of color. So you have students at Brown, minority students at Brown, meeting with the provost and demanding that they be exonerated from any kind of academic expectations like showing up to class, because they have to protect their right and ability to exist on the campus of Brown. So this type of model and rhetoric is now standard. And the idea is that to be a minority on campus is to be at literal risk of your life. So as far as I'm concerned, the threat to free speech, the betrayal of the academic mission of rational discourse, of civil disagreement, is of course a terrifying development. But it is not the worst aspect of academic culture today. The worst aspect is this cultivation of racial victimology and the belief in permanent endemic racism, because that is something you can, even if we were to allow civil debate, that racial victimology would persist, and it is poisoning civil discourse.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, everything you described, almost except for one thing, is absolutely true. I don't think the debate is between psychological or political or cultural, because what we're seeing is an intertwining of all of these trends. But I think where I disagree with you is if you actually look at the dynamics of it, who are in the forefront of promoting these things? As it happens in England, it's in Oxford and Cambridge University, which is the equivalent of Yale, Harvard, and Ivy League universities here. If you look at the leaders of the movement, they're not people of color. They're not minorities of any sort. They come from the most privileged background. They're all white. A very large percentage of them are actually white, heterosexual men. And in my experience, they are as busy demanding safe spaces as anybody else is. Actually, the safe space movement began with feminists off campus. Yeah. But men on campuses just loved it. If you come from that kind of, you went to a private school in upstate New York, or in England, went to a public school that was a privileged school. You went through the whole business. You arrive on campus. Safe space is your métier. This is really what you're really into. And what interesting thing is that in all of these colleges, it's been the white privileged students who have led the way, and then constructed an alliance with people. In England, we have the expression of slumming it. What they're doing is they look for minorities of various sorts and kind of converge and establish a relationship with them. And it seems to me that if we focus on the ideology, and the ideology should be taken up, then we overlook the fact that American adult society is failing to socialize its young people. That the American education system, instead of educating young people for freedom and independence, teaches young people to become passive and to feel victims. And that's really where the victim mentality really begins to kick in. And unless we confront the problem way before these kids get to universities, unless we do something with our educational system, then this problem is going to get worse. And the one point that hasn't been mentioned at all is if you look at the speed with which these changes have occurred. I don't know if you've noticed that one day you hear about trigger warning, somebody murmurs it, and you say, it's just going to go away. It's just some bunch of idiots, in a university. It's just going to go away. In a month, it's mainstream. Yeah. It's institutionalized. One day, you hear about the fact that there's a new identity group on campus. They're half trans, they're half this and half that. You say, well, they're just playing games. What are these children doing? It's going to go away. Within a month, it's like everybody loves them, and it becomes like this new cause that needs to be catered to and cultivated. So the change is very, very, very rapid. And the problem for me is that if this dynamic is anything to go by, if we really understand the dynamic, then the situation is going to get worse, unless we do something about it.
Let me just try to play with this friendly disagreement, if you will.
Friendly, yes.
Yeah. In the question of, is it an ideological versus a socialization underlying matter? It seems to me it's typically politically conservative speakers who are challenged. So if the safe space attraction were universal, let's say Ta-Nehisi Coates came to the campus. Would white conservative students then feel threatened because they're being accused of racism and then try to block Ta-Nehisi Coates? We don't see that. So why isn't it ideological?
It is ideological, but the ideology is not the driving force. So the point is that if you look at, for example, conservative students on campus, now conservative students are very different ideologically than left-wing students are, but yet when push comes to shove, when they feel sort of under pressure, you'll find that members of the alt-right are just as likely to play the victim card as the social justice warriors. I mean, I think it's very, very interesting that there's a mirror image process that's kind of unfolding in front of our eyes. And I find it very disturbing when people who argued for free speech and against censorship yesterday, all of a sudden feel that they need to shut down the free speech of a anti-Zionist, potentially anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish speaker. So there's a kind of double standard that has been built in, and I think that there are, that the mirror image whereby all the youth are ultimately playing the victim card is what we should be disturbed about.
So not confined to the left is your strong view.
Yeah, as it happens, they're the main guilty party at the moment. But what I'm worried about is that whenever there's any kind of reaction by conservative students, instead of independently standing up for freedom and putting forward a clear liberal ideology, liberal in the proper sense, of what we really are all about, they kind of fall back on the safe space, sort of therapeutic arguments, just like their nemesis.
Yeah. Heather, in the context of, you've written a lot about sexual harassment suits on campus, which is a corollary to what's been going on. And you wrote about what you call a kind of a neo-Victorianism that's emerging, about the need to have these codes for sexual behavior and all of this stuff as a kind of a safe space, if you will. So don't you think there's a cultural aspect to all of this as well?
Not necessarily, because I think the whole campus rape myth is also ideological. It's a feminist take on the alleged rape culture that is Western society. And I agree. I think that the anti-BDS movement is a very good counterexample, that you do have more right-wing, the David Project, whatever, so you have Jewish students claiming that they are victimized on college campuses, which I would say is also not particularly believable given the success, academic success of Jewish students. But I still think that the dominant motive here overwhelmingly grows out of the narrative of racial oppression. I can't speak specifically to the leaders at Oxford and Cambridge, the white male leaders there, but my guess is that they are demanding safe spaces not for them, not for a white male Cantab member, but on behalf of minorities or trans students or females that are oppressed. So I also, to be honest, I think that the claim of psychological injury is a pretext. I don't believe it. I don't believe that these people are literally feeling psychological injury. I think they are leveraging that rhetoric in order to make their case against the heteronormative, racist, I can reel off one of the petitions that went around against me after Claremont McKenna: transphobe, colonialist, white privilege, intersectionality. But to point to Professor Furedi's point about the speed with which this stuff gets absorbed, another example is that the Justice Department of the United States has an office called the Cops Office, which was created under Bill Clinton to dole out money to police departments to allow them to expand their size during the 1990s when we still had rising crime rates. So it's a fairly kind of white bread type institution. But in the final year of the Obama Justice Department, they published a report on policing in America that had a sidebar on the concept of intersectionality. Now, you probably have to be pretty into campus politics to have heard about intersectionality, but this is a very au courant concept that rates the hierarchy of victimhood and saying that if you can check off multiple victim boxes in the great totem pole of victimhood so that you're not just black, and you're not just female, and you're not just trans, but you're also disabled, you are the best victim ever, and you're intersectional. So that the cops office and DOJ would be talking about intersectionality, if you see how it's used in campus, is kind of mind-boggling.
Can I just say something about one point, which is Heather was suggesting that it's inconceivable that people would really be as mentally or emotionally upset as they pretend to be. And obviously, there's an incredible element of performance in all this, especially when the cameras are around. People cry and they hug each other. And being in the middle of that is a bit like a medieval passion play. You almost expect people to kind of hit themselves. So there's that performative element to that. But I've been a chief examiner in my department for 20 years. And I remember 20 years ago when it all began to happen. What would happen, exams would occur. And usually about 2 people out of 100 would report mental health problems, or their girlfriend left them, or their boyfriend left them. And that meant they were so traumatized they couldn't do their exams. And I used to laugh about it. And I say, well, tough, go, do your exams. 10 years ago, the number increased to about 15% of students. By the time I stopped being examiner, 1 out of 4 students sort of used these excuses not to write their exams. And we allowed them not to write their exams. The trouble was that at a certain point, when people start talking about their mental health problems, they do begin to internalize their own rhetoric. And one of the things that we're finding on campuses is that when you talk to these young people, they genuinely are traumatized. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We know from human history that if psychologically you play a certain part and you adopt the status of a victim, no matter how privileged you are going to feel hard done by no matter what. Every single sort of smile that a person makes towards you will be miscommunicated as a sign of disrespect. And what we're finding is that actually we do end up with young people being mentally disoriented and confused. So my argument is that if it was simply the case that they were playing at mentally ill, a much easier problem to deal with. It'd be much easier to expose that, to confront that, to isolate it. But when you have people just being literally paralyzed, literally frozen to the ground when Trump gets elected, or in England, Brexit gets voted through, my university begins to look like a clinic. No, it is a clinic. I mean, it has in effect become a clinic, and people do end up being what they kind of pretended to be. So in that sense, we are talking about a public health problem.
If I can just add, though, but I think the data shows that actually, compared to baby boomers, millennials have less mental health problems. There's less drug addiction, there's less suicide, there's less depression. I think your performative analogy is absolutely right. You have self-engrossed, narcissistic students acting out little psychodramas of oppression, and here's the key part, to an appreciative audience of diversity bureaucrats. And there's a codependent relationship between the ever-expanding diversity bureaucracy that is itself dedicated to the proposition of endemic American racism and oppression. My guess is if you could take away the diversity bureaucrats so nobody would be paying these students with their little, fits any attention, it would go away very quickly.
Well, let's talk about that. What is the best way forward? Now, Greg urged us to be of good cheer about all this. It's a little hard after these discussions. But there's a cry to call for civility, and Heather said we need civility to be restored. Is that the best kind of wedge to get back to a freer campus, in your view?
I think we need to work on different levels. I mean, I think everybody in this room can play a positive role depending on your status and your resources. But it seems to me that whatever we do, we got to address the students. I think we need to build up a larger cohort of students who are able to stand on their 2 feet, who are independent-minded, who actually think that freedom and democracy are good things, and most important of all, who feel confident to kick back against all these developments. I mean, initially they will be a minority, but the way that I look at it is that already are a large number of students who feel like that. It's just that there is no mechanism through which they can gain a voice. They are pretty much on the defensive. And I think whatever we can do in terms of providing the moral and the intellectual resources to strengthen those young people by educating, training them. In England, one of the things I'm involved in is providing them with classes on how to speak in public. It's really, really important. It's all done in public. If you can get more young people to get up on their 2 feet and debate and argue in public, the same age as their opponents, that makes a huge difference.
I must say, I never felt that was a cultural shortfall of the United Kingdom, but that may be just me.
Come to England and you'll see.
Heather, what is it? An argument? Is it discipline? Is it alumni not contributing? What can change things?
Well, I think it's not going to change unless we confront head-on the lie that campuses are filled with racism and that American society is filled with racism. It's not because students are claiming they want to shut down speech because they think it is literally threatening their existence because they're so at threat by racism. So I think everybody has to start telling the truth. The next time the students demand to shut down a speaker or a safe space, the college president, and claim that they are oppressed on an American college campus, that college president should stand up and say, "Are you kidding me? You are the most privileged human beings in history. You have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. You have books. Every book that has ever been written is available to you. My faculty are not bigots." What I find so amazing is these students make these claims that they are oppressed by racism. They're basically saying that their faculty are racist. There has never once been a college president that had the balls to get up and say, "My faculty want everybody to succeed." There has never been a more compassionate, tolerant environment in human history. And if he wanted to be really accurate, he could say there's not a single faculty search that is not one mad, desperate search to find minority candidates, and we are admitting students with racial preferences. If you really want to end this, you use meritocratic admissions, because there is nothing that is more driving minority students' sense of being oppressed than the fact that they're being admitted with lower qualifications. And that is an extraordinary handicap to put on them. They have two options. When they end up at the bottom of their class, which is what happens, whether it's in law school or undergraduates, they have two alternatives. They can say, "I am not qualified," or they can say, "I am surrounded by systemic racism." And guess which one they choose?
Okay, I think it's going to be time to open this up to questions. Somebody is going to have a microphone, Debbie, and when she comes to you, please tell us who you are and put it in the form of a question. And Michael Myers is he just can't wait.
Yeah, I'm Michael Myers, Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question is, isn't there a bridge between the 50s, the 60s and 70s with respect to racism on campus? The people who are in charge of the university, they're not the students. They're the faculty and the administrators who are the students of the 60s and the 70s. So there is no campus that I have ever been to where there is separate orientation, separate housing for blacks, Latinos, LGBTs, all that stuff, separate housing, separate orientation, separate everything, without the assent and the funding of the university, the officials of the university. So, Heather, I disagree with you. There is racism on campus. It's racism on the part of the faculty and the administrators, the people who are in charge of the university who have failed in their academic mission. They have not said no to separatism. They have not recognized that people are individuals, not racial groups. And they now create, if you look at every campus, they don't talk about black students, individuals. They say, oh, blacks are communities, and those communities need protection.
All right, Michael, I'm going to frame a question out of that, if I have your permission. All right, and the
No,
question
you
is
don't have my permission.
In 1965, and this is the question of continuity from the 60s to today. I'm going to take that as your question, because I think it's an interesting one. And Professor Furedi alluded to it in general terms. 1965, famous incident. Robert McNamara, then the Secretary of Defense, went to Harvard. He was surrounded by student protesters. They surrounded his car. They beat his car. Very Charles Murray-like incident, right? Seems like those were the same people who are now in charge of the university doing what Heather said, which is the assent to all of this. Is there not a continuity? Do you really see a clean break from the 60s?
Well, there are elements of continuity, and obviously it'd be silly to imagine that the legacy of the past has just disintegrated. However, I think that what is very, very interesting is that two things have kicked in. One is what you're suggesting, which is really, unfortunately, we never had a chance to talk about the specific way that identity politics has become institutionalized, and the way that identity politics has been promoted by the administrators and by, even more than the administrators, this kind of army of diversity officers and consultants. I mean, there is more of these people on campuses than rats. I mean, if you look at the number of new offices that is kind of opening up all the time, it's just unbelievable. So that's really important. However, I've got a PhD student that actually been looking at some of these people, who they are. We're doing, she's doing a study.
The diversity office.
Yeah, of trying to find where they're kind of coming from. And they are not 1960s people. They're the kind of people that in the 1960s would not have gone to university, because in those days it was more difficult to get into a good university. They're the kind of people that might have become, I don't want to be too elitist, maybe working in a shop or a bank clerk or working in local government. But now, because they've got all this training in diversity, they've been imported into the university. And they're a new breed of individuals that have very little in common with the administrators in the big universities. But most importantly, something we haven't discussed, the thing that I'm most concerned with is that if you look at every cohort of academics in campuses, the younger the cohort, the more horrible is their politics. The more censorious they are politically, the more they think that safe space and trigger warning and all these things are really good things. Whereas the older, I mean, the 1960s professoriate might not have politics you like, but actually, when they see trigger warning coming in, they at least know this is not a good thing. They might not open their mouth, but they know that it's not a really good thing. Whereas the younger generations love it. In fact, they write articles saying, in my pedagogy, I discovered that trigger warnings are the height of human civilization. I mean, they really think this is a really good thing. And that tells me that what we're seeing is a relatively new development, that the continuity is you take the 60s rhetoric and you take some of the identity politics, but you reformulate identity politics into a totally therapeutic psychological form where basically racism is redefined in ways that would have been unrecognizable to any anti-racist in the 1960s.
And bureaucratized.
And totally bureaucratized, yeah.
Okay, other questions? Yes, in the back there. Stand up, tell us who you are, and put it in the form of a question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My question is around adult authority. So my name's Viv Regan, and I work at Spiked in the UK and now in the US. And we were inspired by FIRE's rankings, so we did our own in the UK, and we rank now the 115 universities. 115 of them, 90-70% are awful, awful, awful. But the third year now, what we have seen, which is new, is that you've still got the crazy students, the banning sombreros and banning the Christian cross and all these nonsense kind of things. But for the first time, universities in the UK are worse than the student unions. They're guiding the student unions, which we call in the UK, to do their dirty work for them. So it's the universities, the administrations and the professors that are actually saying, we don't like free speech. Now, my question is, and I thought your book was really good, and one of the things I liked about it is that it's as if adults are now organising society around risk averseness and around this idea that we're quite weak as individuals. And I wonder if that was what you're saying, Frank. And if you could tell us more about why it seems such a loss of adults intervening and sticking up for liberty.
Well, I think what I tried to suggest was that adult authority has disintegrated, because adult authority is based upon a confident transmission of the legacy of the past, that the values that your parents held, you pass on to your children. And if now adult society has been psychically estranged from that, you no longer believe in what America stands for or what England stands for, then instead of using a proper method of socialization, you use psychological techniques. And that's why in schools now we have counselors at a very, very early age. Even in daycare centers, we have psychologists coming in there. We have therapists coming in, talking to primary school children, and talking to them in such a way that by the time a child is 9, their vocabulary sounds like as if they've been studying Freud. No, seriously, I'm stressed out, I'm so depressed, I need to chill out. I mean, it's like they studied, sort of Freud's kind of analysis of dreams. And that's because we socialize them into, and they internalize it. And I think it's the crisis of adult authority, ultimately, that we're talking about. But that's not something we can confront overnight until we take our values seriously. And I think where Heather is right, really right, is that we got to tell the truth about who we are and what we believe in, and not really hide our values. And if people say that this is racist, then we shouldn't be embarrassed and look at our shoelaces, but we got to say you're a fool. If you don't know what racism looks like.
Where's the hope that authority is going to assert itself? That's what you called for, exactly what Frank is suggesting, is the authority will step forward. Do we have examples? Is it a vain hope?
Well, I guess it's everybody that believes that in the reality principle has to speak up. I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for anybody else, but I certainly have no patience for the sort of whining narcissism that believes oneself to be victimized by systemic oppression. I think that's absurd. So, there are students on campus that, as Frank says, they're worried about speaking out, but they know the truth. I mean, as far as it being a racist society, the amazing thing is that every high school senior knows everybody else's SATs. They know what's going on in terms of racial preferences, and yet that becomes, you have to pretend that that's not going on. So there are people that see that, in fact, far from being a society that is trying to oppress blacks, remarkably, given America's appalling history of brutal racism and hatred, we have made extraordinary progress and are now trying everything we can to be anti-racist. And so I think people just have to get the courage to speak up and tell the truth.
That's the question, is where that's what you're calling for, is courage, and we're not seeing it. Yes, this young woman over here with the orange scarf. Yes, it's you. Wait for the microphone if you would.
Hi, I'm Catherine Bartley, and I have a question about moral authority and religion. It seems like I remember Greg Lakonoff talked a lot about suppression of religious speech.
Hang on.
Am I not speaking loudly enough? Can you hear me? I heard Greg Lakonoff speak one time, I think, at another Manhattan Institute event, on the suppression of religious speech on campuses. And it seems to me that there's a lack of moral authority that comes from, we're talking a little bit around the bush about morals and civility and socialization. Would it help to, and values, would it help to have more biblical teachings about where we got our values from?
No.
Can I just say something on that a little bit?
I hope you do.
Yeah. Well, I think you raise a very important question because if you speak, never mind religiously, but if you use a moral language, if you appeal to normative sort of ideals, then you're immediately sort of attacked as somehow this horrible person that is trying to impose their values on other people. And I think that the whole domain of morality is something that has become entirely evacuated from campus life. Even, I've given lectures in Catholic universities. And I go to the Catholic university, and I go to the people teaching theology, and they tell me they're scared to teach real theology, the real stuff, in case they are accused of trying to brainwash people. So instead of teaching what I call old-class theology, they go to Hinduism one day, Judaism the next day, sort of Protestant the next day. Basically, it becomes a cafeteria, of diverse religions. So people are really scared to do that. And I think that in many respects, sort of the language of right and wrong, which is where we got to start off with, is really important. And in my case, what I argue when I'm involved in, particularly with hostile audiences, is the importance of non-judgmentalism, which needs to be tackled. Because non-judgmentalism seems to be the dominant ideal in American campuses. We don't judge each other. It's really bad to judge each other. Whereas, in fact, judging each other is one of the fundamental sort of duties of a critical university, where we criticize each other, we judge each other, and then we come together on the basis of having made those kinds of judgments.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
That's a very prevalent argument that we are relativist, and I have a related argument that you're making and Professor Furedi's making is that what we're seeing on campuses is a result of postmodernism and the skepticism towards truth, and it's a nihilism. And I could not disagree more. I think we have hysterical moralists on campus. They know the truth. The truth is that America is racist, that I'm a fascist and a transphobe, not just a fascist, an effing fascist. There is absolutely not the slightest hesitation of passing unrelenting, unappealable moral judgment on people who do not fit in those intersectional categories of transcendent victimhood. So I don't see how anybody could claim that it's a non-judgmental, excessively tolerant place. It's precisely the opposite. It is obsessed with its own sense of moral virtue, and I don't think you need necessarily traditional religion to be a moral person. I think you have to understand the golden rule and be reflective and rational. But what is the case is that we now have a religion of racism that is providing a complete vocabulary and rule book for behavior.
And I infer that what you're saying is that there's a need to tell those who would shout others down that that's wrong. So it's not that there's no quasi-morality, if you will, on campus, but there's no traditional morality.
Or even, forms of secular morality. I mean, none of that seems to be working all that well. I think that Heather is right to suggest that there's an unrestrained appetite for condemning people. So there's no no limits on that. You're wrong. So they are making, in one sense, a judgment. But this is the interesting thing, while basically saying that Heather needs to be beyond the pale because of her ideals. That's all right. At the same time, the domain of the non-judgmental applies everywhere else. And within our safe spaces, because that's the whole argument for a safe space, we don't criticize each other. We don't question each other. We can have segregated and segmented lives. Black people can live there. Gay people can live there. So in a sense, what you've got is a situation where you have non-judgmentalism as the first order principle, and this bitter moralization which kind of comes out of that. Because if we don't have a grown-up debate and grown-up judging of one another, then you do end up with this hysterical, sort of semi-fascistic desire, almost like an old-fashioned anti-Jewish pogrom is what it really reminds me of, that kind of zealous bitterness that kind of comes out of it. But the irony is that the moralizing that is being described coexists with, we're not judgmental. There is no such thing as truth. The two things kind of go hand in hand. And what we got to do is basically say, at the end of the day, they're both equally wrong, because true tolerance is not about being non-judgmental. True tolerance is being judgmental, and judging that your ideas are really stupid, we still tolerate you. I mean, that's what tolerance was really all about, and we got to restate the case for that.
Sounds like a great British novel, Lord of the Flies.
Good book.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last question. I want to bring in somebody from the back of the room, maybe. Yes, right over there. Thank you. Yes, the young woman right on my right.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if any good ideas have come out of political correctness, part one. Number two, I think this is kind of a friendly audience, but when you're actually facing your black, female, trans, disabled, perfect victim, what do you say to her if she actually does feel traumatized authentically, as Frederick suggests, or performatively, as Heather suggests? What do you actually say to them to change their mind? So, two-parter.
Okay, and we'll do it for both.
Has anything good come out of political correctness? Well, I guess, one can read rhetoric of the 1900s, and it's just an amazingly different world with the unapologetic quality of ethnic stereotyping without any concern about equality. So I suppose there's some value in thinking twice about how you talk about groups. But as far as what I would say to a student at Princeton, for example, during the Black Lives Matter protests that swept college campuses in the fall of 2015, following the threatened football strike at the University of Missouri and the firing of the president, there was campuses across the country had all these Black Lives Matter protests. And my favorite moment was Black Princeton students who said, "We're sick and tired of being sick and tired." Now, this was a phrase first uttered by Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a civil rights activist who grew up on a Mississippi cotton plantation and was beaten in the 1950s for trying to vote. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer had grounds for being sick and tired of being sick and tired. But any Princeton student, I don't care if he's black, purple, or green, who feels like he is oppressed is literally out of touch with reality. And so I'm perfectly happy to say to that student, you're wrong. You are not oppressed. You have privilege and resources available to you without a single block. You have every adult on this campus wants you to succeed. And you are being encouraged in having a chip on your shoulder that is not only going to prevent you from seizing the resources that are available to you, that millions of Chinese students are studying day and night right now in the hope of being admitted, but it's going to follow you for the rest of your life and interfere with your opportunity to seize opportunities in life and also distort your understanding of reality.
I'm going to just pick up on one word that was in that question, and that is the word persuade. And is there a way to persuade when you're facing a skeptical audience?
I mean, I think there is. I've debated Black Lives Matter's equivalents. We have a campaign called Rose Must Fall campaign in Oxford. I've debated radical jihadists, and I debated feminists, sort of, cultural feminists on a number of occasions. And my approach has always been, number one, to use humor, because I think it's far better to say you can't be really serious. You don't really mean, and you kind of expose their statements to reality and to the facts. But I think what really seems to work for me and some of my friends who do what I do is we look at an audience, and we know we're not going to convince the hardened zealot that I'm debating, and therefore my job is not to convince him or her, because that's not going to work. But my job is to undermine their credibility in front of the people who are skeptical in the audience. And the way you know that you've kind of succeeded is if at the end of the debate, you're not standing by yourself, right? But there are people coming towards you, you're getting applauses, people laughing at your joke. And I think that there's no reason why, using rationality and humor, and basically not being defensive. I think it's really important not to be defensive. You can really surprise people. And I'm always reminded of the little boy telling to the emperor that you're not wearing any clothes kind of situation. That's what we got to do, is basically say, you're arguing you're oppressed. Well, where is your clothes? What is that kind of based upon? And I think that it is possible. But the key thing is to really address your remarks to that kind of skeptical layer of individuals who are going to be the future of our society. And we have to really encourage them, and we have to inspire them. We have to give them a lead through the language that we're using. And most importantly, by not being defensive, we have to show a bit of courage ourselves. And I think that what Heather did was very, very courageous. There are very few people at the moment who've done this, sort of, and was prepared to stand up and be counted when push came to shove. And I think that's what we need, a few more individuals to do that.
Please join me in thanking Frank Furedi and Heather McDonald.